Those 120 persons now who've been baptized since January 2008 might not have been baptized. And there would be no home for a lay pastor and his family. So I say to you, please try to tell me of a more meaningful mission. Now, Whitney, we could have a little debate about meaningful mission trips, but this, for me, is such a meaningful and fruitful mission. The associate pastor for First Presbyterian Church worked with us every day in Vacation Bible School, and he's learning to speak some English. He's been taking English classes for a month, and he told me that his father was a missionary, and as a child he grew up in the Amazon. And he said, as a child, I couldn't understand why all these Americans came to our country to help build houses and other things. But he said, now as a pastor, I understand. Because he said, the things that the Americans do for us in our community, we could never do those things. That was very helpful for me to understand and strengthen our call to mission in that place. On my first trip to Brazil, this little boy came to the work site every single day. He had on the same shirt, the same shorts, the same rugged flip-flops, and I asked him what his name was, and he said, Ricardo. And as we were, the second week, he didn't come, and I was kind of sad about that. And then the last day that we were there, here he came. And he would help us so much. He'd go get brick, he'd clean it, he'd do anything we wanted him to do. He was 9 years old. And so the last day, how do you say goodbye to someone that you probably will never see again? And so I had on one of my favorite KU t-shirts. And so I took that off and I gave it to him. And he was so grateful. And so as we drove away, I'll never forget, he was standing out there waving goodbye to us. Just a boy in this very severely poor neighborhood that God allowed into my life for that moment. And what was so striking about this little boy was his eyes. His eyes were beautiful. They were so dark, but I can always remember those eyes. And in my sermon, when I returned to Salisbury that year, I talked about this little boy and said that I believe God had used him to help me remember the people of this congregation and not to be overwhelmed by tasks. Now, last week, on the last day of construction, before Richard and I were leaving, there were plenty of people there, and we had worked, and I said, I'm going to walk back to the hotel. It was a beautiful day, and it took over 1 hour to walk back to the hotel. And it probably wasn't the safest or wisest decision for me in the last 2 weeks of my life, but I did. And I told Lucia Santos, Matthew was already gone home, and I said, if he was here, he'd be mad at me for having walked by myself. And she said, I'm mad at you too. She said, you never make such a walk like that alone, and you can't even speak the language. But it was too late. I'd already done it. And as I walked toward the hotel, I was about 20 minutes now away from the hotel. And this Dom Miguel is almost like a far-off subdivision of the town. There are over 100,000 people who live in Hugh Verge, and there are several thousand people who live in this very poor area of Dom Miguel. So I was about 20 minutes from the hotel, and I was walking down the main street that probably is the closest to Ennis Street for us, but it's 4-lane, and there's a median all the way down the street. And as I walked down the street, passing hundreds of people, there was a young boy who was coming from the other direction on a bicycle, and he was going very slowly. And he looked at me, and I looked at him. And then as we passed each other, I kind of turned around to look again, and he was looking at me. And he stopped. So I went over to him, and in the best Portuguese that I could conjure up, I said, what's your name? And he said, Ricardo. And I'm doing my best. I asked him, do you remember me? And he shook his head and smiled. I asked him how old he was. He said he's 14. I couldn't believe this moment. But by the look on his face, he couldn't either. I asked him if he was in school. He said, no, I'm working. And now he has on this beautiful shirt, nice jeans, nice tennis shoes, and a beautiful bike. I said, do you still live in Don Miguel? And he said, yes, and he was on his way home. And I tried to tell him that I had just walked from there, and he couldn't believe that I'd done that. But then I said, in the best Portuguese I could say, I asked him, I said, do you remember when I gave you my T-shirt? And he smiled, and he said, yes. Now, I took his picture a couple of times and kept doing my best to try to tell him how happy I was to be able to see him, and he simply smiled. So I kept walking, and he rode on home. And that was one of the most meaningful moments in the last several years of my life, to see this young boy who had grown into a healthy teenager, and the fact that I had not seen this boy since my first trip. So as I continued walking, I shed a few tears. And then the miracle for me was not that I was actually able to communicate enough with him, but the true miracle was seeing this boy on a street where thousands walk every day, and I just happened to be walking when he was coming by. It was a true grace moment for me. And as I thought about that moment, I realized that this boy was actually a visible sign of all that has happened in this area where he lives, where we have focused our attention for several years. There are now some paved roads. There's now a grocery store. There's now a pharmacy. So much improvement has occurred since the first time I saw the community. And I believe that the Bread of Life complex has only enhanced the improvements there. A feeding program, a school for 250 4, 5, and 6-year-olds, a community garden, an adult literacy program, and a new Presbyterian church with a full-time lay pastor and his family with their new home in which they will live. There will be a meeting on Tuesday of this week with the mayor, city officials, hospital officials, and some of the Americans who are still there. And they're going to talk about the possibility for next summer's mission and the possibility of adding to that complex that exists now, adding a small medical clinic. And it will be the only medical clinic in that community. It's been a hope since the first time that the Presbyterians from North Carolina have gone to Brazil that we would eventually have a medical clinic, and now this is a true possibility. So my hope is that part of our witness season in 2010 will go toward making this clinic a reality. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to go for a few days in the first part of December to firm up those plans for this exciting possibility. So I ask, continue to pray for those who are there now for their last week of work, and begin praying about the mission in 2010. And I can say that all those things that are happening there may not have happened there without the Presbyterians from North America who go. So I stand here this morning and say to you, like Matt said to me in 2004, next year, some of you are going with me. And you may be sitting there saying, yeah. But if you go, I promise you will never find more fulfillment in that span of time in your life. To be part of a mission of true transformation, of a community, of a faith community, of individual lives, and last but not least, that you, like I and those who have experienced this mission already, you too will be transformed.